Our third and last speaker is Annette Desmarais, and she's the Canada Research Chair in Human Rights, Social Justice, and Food Sovereignty at the University of Manitoba. Great title. I wish I had that title. Annette is the author of La Vía Campesina, Globalization and the Power of Peasants, that was published in 2007. She also co-edited the book Food Sovereignty, Reconnecting Food, Nature, and Community, and Food Sovereignty in Canada. That's the book that Hannah mentioned before, Creating Just and Sustainable Food Systems. Prior to obtaining her doctorate in geography, Annette was a small-scale farmer, cattle farmer, and grain farmer in Canada for 14 years. And she also worked as a technical support to La Vía Campesina for a decade. And she continues working with La Vía Campesina, doing participatory research with member organizations. So with that, I'll leave you with Annette, and the title of her talk is Analyzing the Global Food Sovereignty Movement. Annette, please.
Okay, I guess I can just close this, right? Okay. And I really hope I'm not going to have a little coughing fit. I was coughing while you were giving your introduction. I'm really sorry about that. I think it was the woman in the plane who was coughing right beside me. Anyway, thank you very, very much for this opportunity to be here. It's great. I've never been to this part of the USA, so thank you very much. I think actually that it's appropriate in a panel called The Expansive and Expanding Narrative of Food Sovereignty to start by acknowledging the enormous power that the idea of food sovereignty has won over the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, tracing the trajectory of food sovereignty since it was first articulated by the peasants from various countries and small-scale farmers from the north. When it was first articulated, I mean the peasant food sovereignty, when it was articulated at the Second International Conference of the Vía Campesina held in Tlaxcala, Mexico, I think it reveals, when you trace that trajectory, it really reveals, I think, different stages, each with its own or their own interesting dynamics, sites of resistance, and also multi-dimensional struggles. But I also want to take a moment to emphasize the importance of having the capacity to imagine. If you've never seen or heard Eduardo Galeano's poem, El Derecho a Soñar, I think I really would encourage you to go on YouTube, do a search for Eduardo Galeano's Right to Dream, because in that poem he argues that although the right to dream did not feature into the rights that were initially recognized by the UN Declaration of Human Rights, he argues that the international community actually needs to recognize the right to dream because all existing human rights are the result of people actively dreaming, that is, imagining a different future. So it seems to me that we should not underestimate the power of imagination and hope that are so necessary to maintain, to propel social movements' struggles to effect change. And after all, this is actually what food sovereignty is all about. It is about imagining a different future, a future without hunger, without inequality, a future in which ecological sustainability and social justice actually mean something. And the global food sovereignty movement is struggling everywhere and in multiple ways to make all of this a reality. But I also think that it's appropriate to acknowledge La Via Campesina for having first engaged in that very, very difficult, very hard work of first carving out the international political space in which the movement itself could then collectively imagine, debate, and negotiate amongst its vast diversity of experiences, cultures, language, etc., to collectively then define what we now know of, or what we now call, food sovereignty. It seems important to recognize the hard and constant political work it takes to build and maintain that cohesion in this kind of international community of resistance, whose most pronounced characteristic, I would argue, is diversity. All of this to say that I think it's appropriate to begin a presentation on the global food sovereignty movement by thanking La Via Campesina for gifting us food sovereignty. So there's an increased reference to a global food sovereignty by activists and academics alike. But yet, we really haven't seen very much theorizing or analyzing about what exactly this movement is, how it functions, its various strategies, and its tactics. And what I would like to do today is offer just some preliminary thoughts on how we might begin to analyze the movement and discuss some of the challenges. Phil has already mentioned some of the challenges, as has Hannah. But we might think of these challenges in the context of a global food sovereignty movement. And if I have time, maybe we could have a short discussion on what the role of researchers is and research, and perhaps also suggest some questions for further research. So, for those of us who have been involved with food sovereignty since it was first developed, or for those of us who were actually involved in helping to develop the concept, I think that we're all still a little bit surprised to the extent at which the concept has traveled and how much the global food sovereignty movement has actually grown, especially in the last 7 years. Food sovereignty is now discussed, as both Phil and Hannah have mentioned. It's discussed by all kinds of people, all kinds of sectors, all kinds of groups, and at different levels. At provincial government, in the case of some places, at the level of provincial governments, national governments, and also international institutions. So in the process of this traveling, food sovereignty has grown to include new social actors and new issues, as reflected in the concepts that now some people are using, which Phil mentioned: land sovereignty. There's also seed sovereignty. There's also energy sovereignty, and also the international right to food sovereignty. So the momentum generated by civil society organizations and their action by government programs and legislation and international deliberations. And now, I would say more recently, I think academics have arrived to the table a little late, but it's a good thing that we're there. But we have arrived a little late. Given that the concept started, was actually introduced in 1996, and really it's only in the last 2 years that there's been a real surge in the literature on food sovereignty. So, it's taken us a little bit of time to recognize, I think, what was going on. But I think the momentum generated by all of those different actors, including academics, certainly means that food sovereignty is perhaps now the most popular of alternative visions of food and agriculture. That is, if you also count a Google search as any indication of popularity. But since most of us here are already quite familiar with the trajectory of food sovereignty since its peasant inception in 1996 to at least Nélény, I really don't want to go over that well-trodden ground except to mention three important moments. And of course, there's a lot of stuff happened in between the years when it was first introduced to now, but I think that there are three kind of really special political moments. And the first political moment was the Via Campesina's International Conference, the second one held in Tlaxcala, Mexico. And during that meeting, the peasants and farmers from the global north and global south collectively refused to be disappeared and committed themselves to working collectively for the right to exist as peasants and small-scale farmers. And in doing so, they collectively imagined a powerful counter-narrative to neoliberal, large-scale, corporate-led agriculture. They imagined a socially just, rights-based, ecologically sustainable future without hunger, a future based on food sovereignty. Now, this vision then traveled along a somewhat bumpy road for quite some years, for about 6 months, up to the and during the World Food Summit in 1996. The second special political moment, I think, was the Global Forum on Food Sovereignty held in Nélény, Mali. Because I think that that was really a turning point. I say this for two main reasons. The forum successfully brought a lot of new social actors into the fold, namely urban-based movements, and thus helped shift the narrative from being based primarily on production issues to also then including issues of consumption. And secondly, the follow-up to Nélény was quite phenomenal in some places, in that those, one of the commitments that was made at Nélény was that people would go back home and really work hard at building local and national food sovereignty movements in their own localities. And people actually did that. I mean, the Canadian case, I think, is a really good example of that. The third special political moment, I think is, and I think it's fair to say, is the global food crisis that hit the headlines in 2008. Since this provided that kind of special political moment for the advancement of food sovereignty. While international institutions have restructured themselves and global forces persist in further dispossessing many of their means of production and livelihoods, a global counter-hegemonic movement has gained momentum as a growing number of communities of resistance around the world are embracing food sovereignty. So I want to go back to Tlaxcala, to the Tlaxcala conference, just to highlight the North-South collaboration that occurred there. Because this is what, I think, this is what makes food sovereignty so special, and it makes it what it is. Now, as one of the people who was assigned to taking notes and summarizing the discussions at that meeting, and these were, let me tell you, these were very late night discussions, as Peter is very aware of just how long Via Campesina meetings can go when there's a real debate about whatever. So, as one of those people who was taking notes, I can tell you that the Via Campesina organizations took great care to understand each other's realities, each other's interests and needs. And so there was a lot of going back and forth between issues of concern for those living in the global north and those living in the global south. And it is very clear to the Via Campesina that engaging food sovereignty meant or means working in building alliances across different sectors and working at all and different scales. That is the local, the regional, the national, the global, and the global in efforts to change ideas, to change practices, to change structures and institutions. And importantly, it meant understanding the connections between the struggles in the South and the struggles in the North. It meant to the Via Campesina, and I would argue it still means, understanding the connections between all of those place-based struggles over access to and control over resources. Now, since food sovereignty was not conceptualized, nor does it function in isolation, I think it's a real mistake to read food sovereignty as a local global binary. And I think this has some real serious implications for all of those movements who just see the local, who are not able to get beyond their local interests and concerns. But instead, food sovereignty and the global food sovereignty movement recognize what Doreen Massey refers to as the politics of place beyond place, which means, and I quote, a politics both of places and relations between them. It also recognizes what David Featherstone calls, and these are geographers, David Featherstone calls the geographies of connection, or yet another geographer, Simon Springer's notion of relational geographies of resistance, which recognize the global and the local are rarely separable. Instead, they're actually deeply relational, and the struggles feed off of each other. It is precisely all of these diverse, locally based, interconnected struggles against dispossession and inequality that together make up the global food sovereignty movement. It is these communities of resistance everywhere that understand that the persistent crises are about wealth, impoverishment, that is the processes of being made poor, power, and that any solution then, for example, if food sovereignty is a solution, then it needs to address those three things that I've just mentioned. So food sovereignty conceptualized as a global social movement struggle might well be a good example of Michael Watt's, what he calls radicalism writ large, as it embraces local, deeply situated struggles, connects them, and transforms them into a transnational, organized politics of system change. As such, food sovereignty, conceptualized as a global social movement struggle, can be a local, national, and transnational organized politics of anti-enclosure. But for this to happen, those struggles have to be connected. The hard work at making those connections needs to happen. If not, then perhaps we should ask ourselves whether or not that's really food sovereignty. So another key aspect of conceptualizing food sovereignty as a global social movement struggle is the recognition of the multidimensional aspects of struggles. For example, often when a movement adopts food sovereignty, this can often mean that one of the very, very first sites of struggle is within the movement itself. An example of this is the NA in the Basque Country, the Farmers' Union in the Basque Country, in one particular place in the Basque Country, NA Biscaya, which actually struggled for years to maintain unity within the NA, which actually represented the most of the Basque country. But eventually, NA Vizcaya separated from the larger organization in efforts to ensure that it could actually get its hands dirty and really get the work of food sovereignty done. Another example is the distancing of a number of the Mexican farm organizations who were founding members of the Via Campesina, or certainly were, in on the initial discussions of food sovereignty in Tlaxcala. Well, a number of those organizations have now been distanced from the Via Campesina. And again, I think that that's because of the serious effort to actually engage in food sovereignty. And in another case, even within the National Farmers Union in Canada, another founding member of the Via Campesina, it is now facing some significant challenges as the organization, as some members of the organization are really trying to push the NFU to be much more actively engaged in food sovereignty, because doing so means shifting the membership from to include and to embrace smaller scale producers who in the past were not really members of the NFU. So because I'm getting the signal that I should wrap up, there are many other elements of food sovereignty that are multidimensional, and especially when we talk about the state and whether or not and how the state can and should be involved. There are also a bunch of questions that for academics that we need to think carefully about, I think, when we start engaging in research on food sovereignty. And I'm going to just leave it at that for now.
We have time for questions.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you to expound on your last point just a little bit in terms of where you think academic research might go with regard to food sovereignty.
Well, I mean, I think it's a very interesting question because, the question of, for example, who is sovereign? It's a very interesting question. And, we might want to debate that for a long time. We might have a whole lot of different opinions about, or theoretical understandings of what the answer to that question might be. But when you get down to it, to the people who are engaged in food sovereignty in any given community, it doesn't matter what we say about that question, because they're busy defining who is sovereign on a day-to-day basis. So I think what I'm trying to get at here is that I think we need to first decide whether or not and how our research supports the struggles, the food sovereignty struggles. And if so, how then can we engage in research that is of value, that will actually improve the livelihoods of those people engaged in those on the front lines. So I guess I'm arguing for I think just for academics to think carefully about the questions that they want to look into. I mean, who is being served by that question? By, if somebody spends 4 years doing a PhD on a particular question, who's being served? I mean, is there something of concrete value to the social movements that you're doing research with?
Yeah, you have done participatory research, no, with La Via Campesina. Can you reflect a little bit on how that process have been for you personally in the academic circles and all that? Because I know that sometimes people have trouble when they're doing participatory research in the academic establishment. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, it was hard. It was hard because I did my PhD was with the Via Campesina, on the Via Campesina, and in fact, it was very much a participatory research project. That's the way it started, because there was when I started there, I was dealing with the International Coordinating Committee that was in place for 4 years, okay? So we were in regular communication, we agreed on the questions, which countries I would go to, that kind of stuff. After the work was done, and an academic publisher held on to the manuscript for 2 years, constantly telling me that, yes, I'll get back to you, I'll get back to you. Well, 2 years later, that meant that by the time the book, the result, had come out, it was a new international committee. And some of them did not really like, they didn't like, on the one hand, they thought I was criticizing the Via Campesina too much. On the other hand, the academics, argued that I was celebrating the Via Campesina, that I was supposed to be much more critical, etc. So yeah, well, so I think you just have to travel those roads very carefully. But I remember just being very, very, very hurt when I was told at one meeting that the Via Campesina did not want to distribute my book. But then 2 years later, they changed their minds. So but I think it's you go, you work. But on the other hand, right now I'm working with the National Farmers Union, doing work on land, on the land grabbing, land concentration issue in one of the provinces in Saskatchewan, and it's, I think, one of the most important pieces of work that I've done in the last couple of years, because this has the potential to actually influence government policy, because it's up for debate right now whether or not they're going to open up and allow foreign ownership in Saskatchewan. Right now we don't allow foreigners, but there's and they need scientific research, to be able to argue for something different. So, great. Yes.
I surprised you didn't mention the whole series of that short period in time over a few years when there were the big Via Campesina protests against the WTO, like Cancun and Hong Kong and all that, is one of the defining movements of the food sovereignty struggle. And I was reflecting, how in the early stage it really seemed that food sovereignty was counterposed to the WTO, but we don't hear that anymore, much more, and now it seems like it's much more focused on local food systems and agroecology and things like that. So do you have a reflection about that kind of periodization, or how the center of the discussion has shifted over time?
Well, yeah, no, I agree completely that food sovereignty, the language of food sovereignty was very much an anti-WTO or a response, a counter narrative to the WTO. Yeah, I guess I just thought that was kind of, between the lines there of what I was saying for, when the Via Campesina developed the concept in 1996. But I think what's really interesting now is because, and this is why I say we need to remember the importance of imagination, because, everybody's gone back home in a way. And actually they were always at home. The Via Campesina was always clear on the fact that whatever was made up part of the work of food sovereignty. It had to be grounded in local realities. And in fact, the movement itself can't function unless it has a real presence and power at the local level. So they had never left home. But I think that there is, because the WTO allowed the spaces for us, for the movement to get together. There were, every 4 years when the ministerial meeting was called, well, then that was the moment when the global food sovereignty movement gathered together. Those since Néléni, those moments of, meeting are far between now, except for the work on agroecology, right? I mean, if I'm wrong on that, please correct me. So I think that poses a lot of challenges for how do we continue to make sure then that those struggles are connected. If we don't see each other, because those moments were often key moments of debate and arriving at some consensus of how to move forward. And so if we don't actually meet face to face, I'm not sure that the internet replaces the face-to-face meetings. And so I think we need to engage our imagination in how we're going to actually move forward. Because I think Priscilla Claes has actually, she's very right in saying that it's the local that's really the target right now. But we need support for that. If you one of the major challenges in food sovereignty is the repression, the violence that peasant leaders are often faced with when they engage in food sovereignty. Well, how are we going to build a solid solidarity movement to make sure that we're in some way trying to protect people's lives? So,
Thank you very much.
thank you.